When I'm asked what my favorite movie is, my immediate response is always, I can't come up with a work that greater embodies what I love about fiction more than A New Hope. To me, Star Wars is the best of storytelling, a tale of oppression, rebellion, friendship, and finding one's place in the world. It's a generational story, which is why it could be told through Anakin as it was first told through Luke. Its latest iteration, of course, told through a woman named Rey. I'm here today to talk about the Star Wars sequels and what I believe was a great failure to competently retell this story and tell one of its own. How a foolish approach to creating a trilogy hurt every film in it, and how this approach robbed Star Wars of its space fantasy and turned it into just another science fiction franchise. This is Star Wars, a critique of the sequels. The first step to understanding the problems with the sequel trilogy is breaking down their lack of planning. Unlike the original trilogy, where George Lucas took the first act from a nearly 200-page script he had written and used that as the basis for A New Hope and then subsequent films, the sequels had practically no direction movie to movie.
I think he has great reservations. He's really conflicted. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see.
Snoke is the leader of the First Order. He's like the Emperor in the original trilogy.
There's something about this girl that people around her can feel. There's something about her that's going to broaden the story.
What's more, they also seem to have had very little coordination between the two filmmakers who worked on the trilogy, J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson. It was this absence of direction and collaboration that forced Johnson to flesh out the disappearance of Luke Skywalker, something we'll talk about in great detail later. For now, listen to how clear it is that Johnson was left on his own to figure out something as crucial as Luke's backstory.
The first thing I had to do when I was writing the script was figure out why is Luke on this island. I knew, because it's Luke Skywalker, who I grew up with as a hero, I knew the answer couldn't be cowardice. I knew the answer had to be something active. He couldn't just be hiding, and I knew it had to be something positive. He thinks he's doing the right thing.
The importance of this is simple. If you don't know where you're going, you don't know how to get there. The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker are both films that spend time rewriting the ones that preceded them, meaning that every problem originates from The Force Awakens. Before we get to talking about specifics, however, there's one more thing that needs to be mentioned. The people who worked on these films clearly believed that there were concepts that were just a given in the Star Wars universe. Their part in telling the story was never analyzed, much less questioned, because they were considered intrinsic to its identity.
And so we went backwards to go forwards. We embraced everything that we could that felt to us distinctly Star Wars. This whole location of Maz's, of course, mirrors the cantina from A New Hope, as this Starkiller Base mirrors the Death Star. These were the kind of locations that felt like a given in Star Wars. We looked at it like a Western or a fairy tale. What are the elements that you're going to see that makes it this genre, this specific genre? We wanted to give these sort of fundamental, not cosmetic, but sort of prerequisite elements, these locations in which we can set our new story and our new characters.
This is the root of the sequel trilogy's problems. Because it doesn't exist in a vacuum, its attempts to fit its characters into the roles of old characters to mirror the themes of the original trilogy result in several plot inconsistencies. These inconsistencies then splinter off and lead to countless other issues that sabotage all three films. With this in mind, we're going to start with The Force Awakens, and the first example of this, the First Order. The First Order, which is apparently only a part of this story because an establishment oppressor is a box necessary to tick in order for Star Wars to be Star Wars, makes no sense at all. With the Emperor dead and the Empire in ruins, one would think that another dark side Force user taking command of the galaxy would be uniquely far-fetched, but The Force Awakens doesn't care. The First Order just exists, and some would say that's fine because the Empire just existed at the start of Star Wars, but the two aren't really comparable. The premise of the first work of any franchise is distinctively invulnerable to certain criticisms. It cannot contradict anything previously established because it's the very foundation for future plot points that could. The Empire ruled in A New Hope because it was an essential part of its premise, and as importantly, its existence as the ruling entity didn't contradict anything that came before it, or even anything established in the rest of the film. George Lucas himself understood that when you want to tell new stories in an old universe, things can't just exist because you want them to. They revolve around the original work and everything established in it. Here's Lucas talking about the creation of the prequels.
When I wrote the original screenplay, I'd written a backstory for all the characters, so I knew where they came from. And since I was starting this whole thing in episode 4, I had to know kind of where all these characters came from and how they fit together and what the story was. I had the outline, so I kind of knew how the dots connected, but then there's a whole story that has to fit around that. You have to sort of turn that into, another 6 hours of film.
The Force Awakens is not the first Star Wars film, therefore its premise is beholden to the narrative and logic of both the original trilogy and the prequels. So when you see that the First Order is magnitudes bigger and stronger than the Empire, the question that arises is, how? The prequels showed us the time before the Empire that Obi-Wan referred to when he first met Luke. They proved that Darth Sidious did not appear one day and become the Emperor. He had a very well thought out plan that culminated with the destruction of his last meaningful opposition, the Jedi. The First Order is so nonsensical, however, that even if the prequels hadn't created the Rule of Two and demonstrated how much time and effort it took Palpatine to execute his plan, it still runs into the problem of the Empire falling at the end of Return of the Jedi. Granted, The Force Awakens takes place 30 years after that, but that's one of the reasons the First Order is so illogical. Supreme Leader Snoke looks old enough to have been around during the original trilogy, and given his strength with the Force, the idea that he's not seen or mentioned during any of it is convenient at best. Beyond that, like I said, the First Order is demonstrably stronger than the Empire. Where did they find all these resources? How did they build anything under the New Republic? How did they get bigger than the Empire, yet they aren't the status quo? In a deleted scene from this film, Leia has to send an envoy to convince the Senate of the New Republic to take action on the First Order.
I need you to go see the Senate right away. Tell them I insist the Republic take action against the First Order.
The First Order that builds a weapon capable of killing billions of people is not the unquestionable power in the galaxy. Forget how they built this. Forget how insane it is that they have this level of manpower. The New Republic has to be convinced to take action against a group that clearly kills anyone they want, whenever they want. The implausibility of the First Order kneecaps the movie and the trilogy from the start. When your antagonists are cartoon levels of powerful with zero explanation as to how they came to be, it completely trivializes the struggles of your heroes, all because there isn't a more creative way to oppress its characters than just redoing the Empire. The First Order is only one of many instances where The Force Awakens fails to integrate a concept from the original trilogy because it would rather copy it than figure out how to properly reinvent it for a fresh take. It should come as no shock that The Force Awakens gleefully created Kylo Ren from the same place of creative bankruptcy.
The character of Kylo Ren was one of the most challenging characters because he sort of embodied what this movie was. It was a new story, a new personality, created from the DNA of what had come before. But because he was the villain, it meant he was in the shadow of Darth Vader. So we embraced Vader. We made our bad guy aware of Vader as he would be living in a post-Vader time and made him the son of Leia Organa and Han Solo.
Kylo Ren is deceptively problematic. He's the only character who benefits from being created as a narrative clone, though the story of The Force Awakens and later films suffer massively because of it. There's nothing wrong with Ben Solo being a troubled young man torn between the two sides of the Force, given the history of his family. His emulation of Vader can even be considered natural. We all resemble our influences when we're first starting out. What The Force Awakens didn't understand is that these traits made him a fundamentally different character than Vader when we were introduced to him, yet Kylo still occupies the same role. Kylo's repeated failures in this movie do plant the seeds for an interesting character, but his incompetence as a villain opens the door for a hero whose strength is difficult to explain. The opposite end on the spectrum of competence in The Force Awakens brings us to Rey. Rey is fine until the film gets overly gratuitous. The idea of a lifelong scavenger not only fits the Star Wars hero archetype, but it also gives Rey autonomy. Her resourcefulness, ability to defend herself, and even being bilingual are not outside the realm of believability. I think these traits alone would have given us a unique protagonist, but this isn't enough. Rey is also a full-blown linguist, a great pilot, a skilled mechanic, and she's not only strong with the Force, she is proficient with it. This is the problem with Rey and what creates the disconnect between Rey and Luke Skywalker. Rey can't faithfully represent the themes that Luke could because of the differences in her character. Any similarities between them end at the conceptual level, since Rey becomes so overloaded that her triumph becomes an expectation. Rey accomplishes more in one film than Luke did in two, with no feasible explanation besides her parents passing off their abilities with the Force. There's nothing explaining how she's able to resist Kylo Ren's interrogation and flip it on him, how she knows of mind tricks and how to execute them, and the biggest one of all, why Anakin's lightsaber calls to her. This is why The Force Awakens making its villain still in training but so close to Vader was a huge mistake. Rey's strength is enabled by the movie allowing her to repeatedly beat Kylo Ren at his own game. If your hero is constantly besting your villain, what goal is there for them to overcome? By not making its villain a seasoned veteran that a novice like Rey couldn't possibly beat given her lack of training, The Force Awakens gets away with having an overpowered lead who can only get stronger from here. On a side note, Anakin's lightsaber is arguably the greatest question mark of this trilogy, as they never, through the course of 3 films, try to explain how it ends up in Maz's palace. This is especially egregious because they wrote how it did and then cut it from the film.
In fact, in the original script, you saw the lightsaber falling through space and landing in the ground and a hand taking it. And you used to have this entire backstory where we learned what happened with the lightsaber, Luke's lightsaber, over the years and how it ended up finally in the hands of Maz Kanata. All of that became backstory, and in fact is thrown away in one line now in the movie.
Back to Rey, the critiques of her character are only the result of an examination of the rate of her achievements that conflict with virtually every Jedi the series has seen before. The only logical explanation the film alludes to are her parents that abandon her, but their identities are, of course, occluded from the audience as well. Even midi-chlorians would have been better than The Force Awakens creating mystery for the sake of creating mystery. Almost all of the problems The Force Awakens creates for itself and the rest of the trilogy exist because it desperately wants to be A New Hope, but it doesn't care how its new characters don't fit into that story. Nothing demonstrates The Force Awakens' misunderstanding of A New Hope and how to convey its themes better than its mess of a third act. The second act of A New Hope ended with the death of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Its third act ended with the destruction of the Death Star. It's important that these two events were separate, if only for the immediate and obvious reason that the tension of one didn't steal from the other. But more importantly, it put the characters into positions that forced their development. Luke fulfilled his dream of becoming a pilot, and Han Solo proved that he was more than a smuggler for hire. Obi-Wan's death was an integral part of both of these things happening. Luke was a small-town boy who Obi-Wan introduced to the rest of the world. Once Obi-Wan was gone, there was no one left to hold Luke's hand. He's left to face his greatest challenge alone, except he wasn't because he had friends. Because of Obi-Wan's death, Luke became his own man, which wouldn't have been possible if Obi-Wan fighting Vader and Luke taking on the Death Star were happening at the same time. The Force Awakens combines the second act and entirety of the third of A New Hope into one, and while it would be unfair to say that it doesn't benefit at least two of its characters, it is fair to say that it's not nearly as effective overall because of its differences and additions. Playing the mentor is Han Solo. If Finn was the main character of the movie, Han would have played the part well. Han helps Finn navigate the world outside the First Order. After Finn defects, he is dubious, perhaps even cowardly, which is why it's great that he finally confronts his fear of the First Order by taking on Kylo Ren after he kills Han. Kylo, on the other hand, has struggled the entire film with accepting the dark side, and by killing his father, he finally does. So, what's the problem? You have two characters who are exactly the kind of innovation of core Star Wars concepts that the movie needed to be new but familiar, fighting it out in the climax of the film. The problem, obviously, is that Finn isn't the main character. And as all this is happening, the Resistance is flying around trying to take out Starkiller Base. So we know that no one is in immediate danger because if the Resistance succeeds, they will kill Rey, Finn, and Chewbacca. Poe Dameron is unfairly caught in the middle of all this. It's not his character that's the problem, it's his place in the final act. Poe doesn't achieve anything we don't already believe him to be capable of. He's clearly an exceptional pilot, and therein lies the problem. The entire battle at Starkiller Base plays second fiddle to what's going on with Rey, Finn, and Kylo because Poe is already a complete character. There's nothing of particular interest in his plight besides the spectacle, which means that there's considerably less investment in this than there was in this. In A New Hope, the characters that needed to grow take part in the last fight, and the ones that didn't were on the sidelines, but this would have been difficult to do in The Force Awakens when one of the characters that should have been sidelined is the best pilot in the movie. It's this mistake and making Han Solo the Obi-Wan of the film that spoil the third act. While Han verifies that everything Rey has heard about the Jedi is true, he isn't a Jedi himself, which greatly diminishes his potency in the role of mentor to the point where an entirely new character has to be introduced to articulate the Force to Rey. That means that Han's death isn't directly related to Rey's awakening in the same way that Obi-Wan's was to Luke's. Luke didn't forego his computer targeting because he suddenly believed in the Force. He accepted the Force because Obi-Wan asked him to trust him, which had much more impact than Rey remembering the Force exists. What does Rey really gain from her fight with Kylo? What does she conquer in doing this? Finn faces his fears, Kylo kills his. But what does Rey fear, and how does she interact with it by fighting Kylo? The only thing Rey seems to worry about is returning to Jakku to wait for her parents, but that isn't really addressed by the outcome of this fight, and she was already resolute in returning BB-8 to the Resistance before being kidnapped by Kylo. She fears being alone, as evidenced by Kylo's interrogation of her, but if the end of the film is meant to solve that, it does it poorly by nearly killing her only other friend. In the context of the third act, Rey feels like a third wheel, even though she's the main character. The Force Awakens laid a poor foundation to build a trilogy off of. Every interesting and well-executed idea it had was sandwiched between an uninspired and confusing attempt to depict some of the early themes of Star Wars. By going about the creation of the film's story in this manner, they established key details that future films couldn't go without incorporating into their own stories. The biggest of these we haven't even talked about, despite it being in the very first minute of the film. Luke Skywalker has vanished. This single sentence crippled the sequel trilogy worse than anything I've talked about so far. All I've critiqued up to this point is only possible because of this line, and while The Force Awakens is certainly to blame for basing the entire story of 3 films off Luke's disappearance, It's The Last Jedi that ruins the trilogy because of what it's forced to do with that setup. For a film that questions the past as much as The Last Jedi, it's such an obliviously derivative film that trying to understand its goals to critique them is another tedious examination of comparisons. In my critique of the 2017 live-action Ghost in the Shell adaptation, I coined the term greatest hits films, which are movies that take the most recognizable aspects of their original work and paste them into theirs without any consideration for narrative cohesion without context. The Last Jedi is undoubtedly a greatest hits film, and for all the flack The Force Awakens justifiably gets for being a poor remake of A New Hope, The Last Jedi is a terrible amalgamation of Revenge of the Sith, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. But this is only a part of why it fails. The Last Jedi had countless opportunities to mend the issues created by The Force Awakens, and while it's not the fault of the film for being put in that situation to begin with, it still makes almost every single one of those issues worse by either not addressing them, amplifying them, or by betraying its characters. You see the first glimpse of this in the film's opening. I said that in The Force Awakens, the First Order is demonstrably stronger than the Empire. In The Last Jedi, the First Order is demonstrably stronger than the First Order. All of these movies suffer from bigger is better, where more of an element that we've seen in the past is shown with no regard for its implications or effects on the story. Here is Snoke's mega star destroyer, the Supremacy, in comparison to any spacecraft previously seen in the movies.
So he needed a huge ship.
This is ridiculous. Any tension that the First Order imposed on the story is completely gone when there is seemingly no end to their strength. The last movie didn't explain how any of this was possible, and neither does this one, so the struggles of the characters are always undermined by the thought in the back of your head asking why any of this is happening. Instead of giving an explanation, The Last Jedi doubles down with its absurdity, and that translates to Snoke as well. In The Force Awakens, Snoke is definitely strong with the Force, as proven by his ability to sway Kylo Ren to the dark side, but he is also visibly frail and obviously disabled. It's unclear how J.J. Abrams was going to further incorporate Snoke into the story, but Rian Johnson clearly had different plans because Snoke underwent a visual redesign under his request.
Rian said to me very early on, I want to ground him back in reality. I want him to be a character that the other characters in the film can actually respond to and actually relate to. Rian eventually came to me and quite honestly he said, it's not quite feeling right.
What Rian felt was that he actually didn't feel as much of a threat as he wanted him to. He felt like his deformity was too debilitating.
Brian and I sat down and we were thinking about what we could do, and we came up with the idea to open his chest up. We gave him broader, heavier set shoulders.
And we also scaled him up in the process. We took him another half a foot taller.
By grounding Snoke and making him a character that everyone else can believably interact with, the film creates the perception that Snoke is the strongest Force user ever seen. Each time it idiotically shows him using his abilities, it only serves to create further intrigue into Snoke's origins, because we know you can't become a master at any of these things in a short period of time. Because of how nonchalantly the film presents Snoke's power, the film raises the expectation of an explanation, even if it wasn't responsible for Snoke's existence. With that said, Snoke's appearance marks the only thing I feel The Last Jedi does well: his interaction with Kylo Ren. Kylo needed to move on from Vader's identity. It serves its purpose in The Force Awakens, but to keep this aspect of the character around when they've clearly progressed past it would have been a mistake. By chastising Ren for his failure and rightfully pointing out that he's no Vader, Snoke pushes Kylo to discard his ties to him. The destruction of the helmet is not only in character, but also the only intelligent way the film pushes past the past. The rest of the film either does not understand the past or intentionally misrepresents it in order to deconstruct and critique the themes of the films it's copying. Luke's isolation, Rey's training, and Snoke's death are all things we've seen before. The issue is the same as it was in The Force Awakens. You cannot put new characters into identical situations as old characters because the context will never match. In the case of The Last Jedi, that means new motivations don't make sense because they were forced in order to match the circumstances of the original situations. Luke Skywalker is the Yoda of this film. The Last Jedi's desecration of Luke stems directly from a misunderstanding of Yoda's character and his circumstances.
Into exile I must go. Failed I have.
At the end of Revenge of the Sith, the Jedi were soundly defeated by Darth Sidious. Yoda failed not only to stop Sidious, but to even see him in his midst. If anyone should have been critical of the arrogance of the Jedi, it would have been him. So why isn't he in Empire Strikes Back? While George Lucas likely did not think that far when Empire script was being drafted, Yoda's reasoning is still clear in both Empire Strikes Back and Revenge of the Sith. His exile to Dagobah is not out of shame. It's for Luke and Leia. Because he failed to destroy Sidious, he must exile himself until he can help train them to defeat Vader and the Emperor. He and Obi-Wan agree that they will disappear until the time is right. Yoda clearly feels great lament for the fallen Jedi, but it doesn't preclude him from his duty, nor does it cause him to sever his connection to the Force. And why would it? The Jedi aren't responsible for the actions of the lunatic who sought to kill them. Yes, the Jedi failed, but if the Jedi didn't exist, there would be no one to combat the Sith or the Empire. The reason Yoda goes into exile is because he can't die before he trains either of the Skywalker children. If he stayed in the open, he surely would have been killed, given Sidious's power and reach. The Last Jedi not understanding the characters of previous films is so utterly disastrous because it then projects this misconception of them onto its own characters. In this case, projecting what it thinks Yoda should have felt and behaved like on Dagobah onto Luke. This is not Luke Skywalker. This is Yoda if your interpretation of Yoda is that he's a failure who got all the Jedi killed.
The greatest teacher failure is.
From there, it's easy to see why Luke's behavior in this film is so jarring and inconsistent with the Luke Skywalker we see in the original trilogy. Luke's actions make a lot more sense if you consider that this Luke is written to have knowledge and retrospect entirely irrelevant to him, almost as if it's what the filmmaker thinks the Jedi are, versus what Luke thinks the Jedi are. Luke in this film is nothing but a mouthpiece for a commentary that doesn't fully understand what it's critiquing. Even the dialogue is reductive and almost fourth wall breaking, which doesn't sound anything like Luke.
You don't need Luke Skywalker.
Did you hear a word I just said?
You think what? I'm gonna walk out with a laser sword and face down the whole First Order?
Luke was the one character who always believed. From manually landing the shot into the exhaust port on the Death Star, to saving Han and Leia from Vader, and then finally turning Vader back to the light. To even have him doubt his ability to bring Ben Solo back into the light is already tremendously out of character, but to actually ignite his saber against him is ludicrous, and a trap the film sets to have him fail when the character wouldn't have behaved like this to begin with. Another side note here, but it's important to talk about how ridiculous the idea of Snoke turning Ben Solo is. Snoke presumably never met Ben Solo face to face until after Ben turned. There's little chance someone this formidable would not be immediately recognized as dangerous and therefore have been killed or at the very least engaged by Luke. The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi actually want us to believe that Snoke is so powerful he can turn someone to the dark side with no physical contact. This implies that Snoke is far stronger than Palpatine, who spent over a decade gaining the trust of Anakin Skywalker before turning him. Palpatine also had it easier because Ben Solo didn't suffer through the death of his mother like Anakin did. This trilogy wanted its own Vader and Emperor, but couldn't even be bothered to steal either of their origins properly. Back to Luke. Can heroes fail? Of course they can. Luke loses to Vader, Yoda loses to Sidious, but these failures are the result of pursuing goals that align with previous characterization. In both those situations, the characters crash and burn with their ideals intact. But in The Last Jedi, Luke's failure is at odds with any of his previous behavior. Another relevant question is, can heroes change their minds? Absolutely. Yes. In a series impacted so heavily off of a single change of heart, it'd be disingenuous to say that characters can't change. But what happens to Luke isn't change. Luke Skywalker, who saw what the Empire did to the galaxy, who saw what the dark side did to his father, would not abandon his sister and let it all happen again. Rey is more Luke than Luke is in this film, which says a lot because of how badly Luke's character arc is butchered, so parts of it can be used for Rey's. If you examine Luke's arc through the original trilogy, Empire is his lowest point. After becoming a rebel hero, he's eventually brought back to reality by the Wampa Mauling. Then he goes to Dagobah and behaves exactly as Yoda predicts he would. His impatience and fear lead him to rush his training and ignore what the Force tries to tell him in the cave. Losing his hand and Vader's revelation are the consequences of his arrogance. In Return of the Jedi, he learns from this and trusts the Force after feeling conflict in his father. He doesn't fall for the Emperor's taunting, nor does he kill Vader. The trilogy ends with a character who overcame their defeat and is complete because of it. The Last Jedi takes several elements of this arc for Rey, but it doesn't work because it doesn't use them sequentially, and it doesn't seem to get that characters need to reflect on what they consider personal failures to grow. They also need to have personal failures in the first place. If we chart Rey's arc after she defeats Kylo Ren, her lowest point comes in her disappointment that Luke Skywalker isn't the father figure she wants him to be. Whoever this is definitely isn't going to teach her anything, and her vision in the Mirror Cave only reaffirms her feeling of abandonment. I think this, by itself, is great. The issue is that Rey has had no real peril up to this point. A situation that shows why she needs training or a master is never shown in this film or the last. So while yes, Rey is confused and in pain, she doesn't need Luke in the same way Luke needed Yoda. That means that Rey's disobedience has the opposite effect on her character. Rey's telling off of Luke and leaving him is actually a high point because she realizes that she doesn't need this bum to tell her who she is or what she should do. Rey leaving the island thinking that she's right doesn't develop her character the way the same mentality did to Luke, because Rey is right. Rey turning herself in is a copy of the scene where Luke does the same in Return of the Jedi, meaning that for Rey, her moment where she has a material loss to the villain is skipped over. Instead, Rey is only validated that there was conflict in Kylo when Kylo kills Snoke. And then, with Kylo and the magic of editing, they defeat 7 elite Praetorian guards together, proving that Rey never needed a master at all. By so greatly ruining Luke's character in this film, it gives Rey moral authority which absolves her of any failure she could have grown from. Couple this with her insane unexplained power and you have a character with no flaws or weaknesses. While the film has the right idea by making her confirm her worst fear, that her parents are dead and were nobodies, it makes no sense. Vader's reveal to Luke was the worst thing he could have heard at the time. Likewise, Kylo's confirmation of what Rey says is also the worst thing she could hear at the time. The key difference is that Vader is an infinitely more credible source of information than Ren. How would Kylo, who met Rey 3 or 4 days ago, know the truth about her parents? Even the interrogation scene in The Force Awakens wouldn't explain how Kylo knows, because he's wrong. He says they're in a ditch on Jakku, but in Rey's Force vision, someone leaves her on the planet and rides off. Maz also tells Rey her parents aren't coming back. So were those her parents? If they weren't, why were they shown? And if they were, how did they end up on a ditch on Jakku when they're leaving it. That 3 or 4 days part is also more important than the film realizes. In the span of a few days, Rey goes from knowing nothing about the Force to taking on elite guards and later lifting all of these rocks. Why does the Resistance even need Luke? Give Rey a week and she'll be stronger than him. Oh, and if you forgot, Rey's parents were nobodies, so nothing explains this at all. The only thing Rey was wrong about was Kylo's true intent, though no one but Luke suffers any consequence for that because his sacrifice was almost a foregone conclusion due to how the film was structured. As long as the Resistance was going to be cornered on Crate, they were going to need someone to bail them out, and since there was no real plan after the Resistance was tracked through hyperspace, the only way Luke could have survived was if he left with Rey. His death can't really be blamed on anyone but himself, which is why, while visually stunning, it has little impact. Luke's parting line is also patronizing and contrary to how he feels earlier about his failure with Ben.
See you around, kid.
The Last Jedi admittedly didn't have much of a choice with Luke. He was already self-exiled in The Force Awakens.
Luke felt responsible. He just walked away from everything.
But it did have a choice with Rey and its supporting cast. What this movie does with Finn and Poe is baffling, but before we get to that, I'd like to talk about how this film revealed Leia's Force powers. This isn't complicated. If you are thrown into space, you will die. A character returning from an impossible situation overshadowed an example of Kylo's conflict and a genuinely shocking moment. Leia using the Force feels more like a get-out-of-jail-free card to shock the audience, but not actually pull the trigger on killing off the character. Not that Leia can't use the Force, that's great, but using it in such a ridiculous manner creates so many questions that it takes you out of the film. The movie doesn't even have the sense to reveal Leia's Force powers as a way to escape the cave on Crate. As for the rest of the characters, Poe Dameron goes from ace pilot to blithering idiot. He is flat out wrong on every call he makes, from taking on the Dreadnought to hinging his hopes on Finn. The former results in the death of every Resistance bomber, and the latter just fails. The idea with Poe was to have him grow from hero to leader. Commendable because following and leading are two different things, but just making mistakes doesn't translate to growth, especially if the character never acknowledges their mistake afterward. Taking on the Dreadnought was pointless to begin with, since it implies the First Order have limited resources and destroying the Dreadnought would be anything but a mosquito bite. Poe also states that the Dreadnought is a fleet killer, but the Grand Republic fleet was already destroyed in The Force Awakens. This measly fleet is the only Resistance fleet left, and could have been taken out by any of the Star Destroyers accompanying the Dreadnought. The destruction of the Dreadnought accomplishes absolutely nothing. Poe not being informed about Holdo's plan is stupid at every turn. On one hand, this lunatic doesn't care how many people he gets killed, so Holdo giving him a reason to mutiny by revealing that her plan is to just leave would have been unwise. On the other, by not telling him, Holdo gave him reason to conspire against her anyways because he was going to do what he thought was right regardless. Poe is neither entirely right nor wrong on this matter, which complicates any lessons he's supposed to take from this. Holdo's plan is terrible and only salvaged by a last-second audible that addresses a problem Poe correctly predicted would happen. At the end of the film, Poe finally gets it. He sees the bigger picture, but the film could have arrived there with any number of events that didn't result in such a sudden shift in character. By the way, here's this.
He's gonna win. He's gonna have the big, blowing up the Death Star moment, but at a cost that, in terms of the bigger picture, was not worth it.
Poe already had that moment when he destroyed Starkiller Base. Why would he need it again? And why is Poe the only character of the new cast that makes a grave mistake? This film's priorities were all over the place, and there's no better example of that than Finn. I don't think The Last Jedi cared about Finn. at all. Its story is structured in a way where Finn's addition to it is negligible. You could take him out of the movie and nothing changes. This is an issue that can be traced back to the end of The Force Awakens, where the character was incapacitated. But The Last Jedi shares the blame as well for taking place directly after that. There's nothing for Finn to do under these circumstances, which is why his involvement is so inconsequential. Finn was too important to be left out of the film, but also not important enough to go with Rey to find Luke in the first place. If The Last Jedi was smart, it'd have killed two birds with one stone and revealed Leia's force powers as a way to maintain the pretense that Finn was a main character. Instead, Finn's personality is reset, and any prior hinting that he could one day be a Jedi is squashed, despite having his potential mentor right in front of him. Ignoring how questionable it is that Finn is up and about after Kylo nearly vaporized his spinal cord, what's more eyebrow-raising is that he's a coward again. I thought him fighting Kylo marked the end of him constantly running from the First Order. It's hard to say with any certainty that this behavior is inconsistent, since no time passes between these two events, but it's very strange to go from a scene where he puts his own life at risk defending someone he cares about, to bailing on the people that saved his life. Rose is right. Finn is selfish for this. At the first sign of trouble, he's out of here. There's no reason a scene like this that sets the character back should be in the film. I suspect it's here solely to introduce Rose, which is the beginning of the end for Finn. Rose is the personification of one of the most annoying things about The Last Jedi. There's countless times in this film where characters aren't talking to other characters, they're talking directly to the audience.
The dead in a pauper's grave in the Jakku Desert. You have no place in this story. You come from nothing. You're nothing.
Finn and Rose on Canto Bight is the most boring example of this. Rose doesn't tell Finn, a child soldier, anything he didn't already know about the war machine. That's because her statements aren't meant for Finn, they make no sense in that context. Her statements were meant for us. Her entire character is, similar to Luke, a commentary, but it falls flat because it's the most basic anti-war commentary ever. The film actually does a much better job showing us the negatives of eternal conflict in its opening sequence. Finn and Rose also don't work together simply because their plan is awful. Setting aside the fact that they don't even bring back the codebreaker they were originally looking for, their plan relies on turning off the Supremacy's active tracker so the Resistance can't be tracked through lightspeed again. Once the tracker is disabled, the Resistance has 6 minutes to jump to lightspeed before anyone notices it's off. The issue is, how are they supposed to get off the Supremacy and back to the Resistance in 6 minutes time? They didn't even plan for this until they were on the ship.
Good time to figure out how we get back to the fleet.
I know where the nearest escape pods are.
They get caught because the idea that no one would recognize Finn, or at the very least not notice that these people don't belong on this ship, is comical. Then they're both saved from execution by Haldo ramming into the Supremacy at lightspeed, which only happens because they couldn't disable the tracker. So they win despite losing, which makes everything they did pointless. Finn doesn't even get to beat Captain Phasma, she falls to her death. Finn says he is rebel scum, which the film uses as a defining moment, but this is something we already knew by the end of The Force Awakens. The Last Jedi is the one that puts this into question and then arrives at the same conclusion anyways, proving that everything Finn does from the moment he wakes up to arriving on Crait is a waste of time. Finn's suicide run on Crait is another mind-boggling moment, as it once again implies that the First Order have limited resources and or that the Resistance can do anything to them. If the First Order wants to get into the base on Crait, something tells me that just destroying this cannon wouldn't stop them. This is a problem caused by the aforementioned bigger is better mentality. The First Order just had their flagship split in half, and nearly all of the Star Destroyers accompanying it obliterated, but they can still deploy all of these fighters and a legion of ATM-6s. Why would destroying this cannon impede them when nothing else has? To say Finn is wasted in this film would be a gross understatement. What the previous film promised was taken from him, and he was relegated to a minimal role that made his character look confused at best and foolish at worst. The Last Jedi was a disaster. It ruined the trilogy with its widespread character assassination because it's an exceptionally arrogant film. In order to deconstruct something, you need to be able to articulate or demonstrate its premise. It has to be presented before it's interrogated as a theme or trope, so you understand what's being picked apart. The Last Jedi's obsession with challenging what you think you know about Star Wars is infuriating because it never argues for those ideas in good faith, and comes to its conclusions based on a blatant misrepresentation of them. You can't have a cohesive trilogy when the second part of the story blows up everything established in the first, and betrays everything about the original work. After the release of The Last Jedi, the biggest question going forward was, how is a third film going to work? The conclusion to the sequels was going to have to deal with its main villain being killed, its universe shrunk, and the unfortunate passing of Carrie Fisher. It's difficult to say whether any film could have withstood this amount of logistical complications, but what we finally got was worse than anyone could have imagined. The Rise of Skywalker is the least Star Wars film ever made. Of all the ways that the sequels betray Star Wars, mutating its space fantasy into generic science fiction is their worst offense. I stress generic here because there's a difference between science fiction and the perception of science fiction. These films are the latter, and here's the problem with that. Star Wars is not a series that has ever been defined by its science. Any attempts to demystify its intangible elements like the Force have been met with great criticism because they over-explain, contradict, and remove mystery from a fantastical element that helped create investment in its characters. Star Wars' greatest success is how relatable a story it is, despite it taking place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. There's a part of us in Star Wars. The fantasy in the story breaks down aspects of life and reconstructs them in unreal ways that we better understand under the lens of entertainment. This is why Star Wars is as much for adults as it is for children. Its themes don't stop resonating when you grow up, you just see them differently the more you understand the world. Science fiction is antithetical to Star Wars because the series isn't about the impact the science and technology of the universe have on the characters. Star Wars also doesn't conflate its fantasy elements with science and technology and exaggerate their importance to tell its story. While it could be argued that the prequels moved the series closer to the science fiction category with the introduction of midichlorians and other similar elements, it's the sequels that definitely push Star Wars over the edge in this regard. Because they don't have a coherent or mapped story, the sequels have to rely on iconography to carry their failed retread. Lightsabers, ships, and the Force have more relevance in the story than ever. The sequels are less about the characters and more about how the characters are affected by these things. It's literally in the title. The Force Awakens, which places heavy importance on the Force before any of its characters. This is junk science fiction, the kind that cherry picks cool science things and displays them ad nauseum to make up for a lack of substance. The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi are both guilty of this, but at least they still try to harken back to the original themes of Star Wars to flesh out and realize their characters. The Rise of Skywalker gives up. There is no relatable story being told here. There is no story being told, period. The Rise of Skywalker is nothing but a collection of cool science things from the Star Wars universe that destroys the nuance of the franchise and puts the final nail in the coffin for the sequels.
We've decoded the intel from the First Order spy, and it confirms the worst. Somehow Palpatine returned.
The Rise of Skywalker is a do-over, a complete repossession of the story by J.J. Abrams. This kills the film because the story it's trying to tell is just as rancid as the one it spends so much of its time correcting. The dead speak is the only evidence you need that this trilogy had no plan. The Last Jedi killing off Snoke and this film's refusal to make Kylo Ren the central villain writes it into a corner where the only credible antagonist left is the Emperor. Somehow Palpatine Returned is almost self-aware, with the line explicitly saying, "We don't know how he's back, and we're not going to try to explain it." As it turns out, the Emperor has actually been in the shadows acting as puppet master the entire time, and is responsible for everything in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. There's numerous questions that arise due to this revelation, but I've narrowed them down to the most important. Number 1, how does Palpatine survive exploding and the explosion of the second Death Star? Number 2, if Palpatine actually did die, how does he come back to life in his cloned body? Number 3, if Palpatine is able to clone himself and transfer his consciousness into another body, why doesn't he just pick up where he left off at the end of Return of the Jedi? Number 4, if Palpatine is able to clone himself and transfer his consciousness into another body, why does he create Snoke? Number 5, if Palpatine is able to create beings with strong force abilities like Snoke, why doesn't he transfer himself to that body instead of the rotting body he's in? Number 6, does Snoke have autonomy? If so, why? Number 7, if Palpatine made Snoke, but his plan is to have his granddaughter Rey succeed him, why is Snoke hell-bent on killing her? Number 8, who did Palpatine have relations with to conceive Rey's father? Number 9, if Rey's father is really a clone, why didn't Palpatine inhabit his body? Number 10, if Rey's father is a clone of Palpatine who couldn't use the Force, why can Snoke? Number 11, if Rey's father was created on Exegol, how did he leave? I've gotten a bit ahead of myself, but you get the point. The Return of the Emperor is undoubtedly the most illogical plot point in this series, and equally dumb are the attempts to justify it.
The idea came up of, well, what if Palpatine lived on in some way? Within about 30 seconds of discussing that idea, we just knew that it was the right idea, because we knew that this has always been a story of Skywalkers and Palpatines.
No, that's not what Star Wars is about at all. Reducing Star Wars to a story about two bloodlines ignores every message the films have about life as told through the adventures of the characters. Bringing back Palpatine doesn't even serve the purpose of having an obstacle for the heroes to overcome, because his addition to the story is out of nowhere and symbolizes nothing. He is now just evil man as opposed to cunning authoritarian or the heart of temptation. Centering itself around the return of the Emperor is the film's greatest mistake. By forcing the story to both retcon and contort itself to rationalize his involvement, it breaks every character. The last we saw of Kylo Ren, he discarded his ties to the past, killed Snoke, and became Supreme Leader. In this movie, he rebuilds his mask and is relegated to errand boy again after he becomes a pawn to another master once Palpatine and the Final Order are revealed to be more powerful than the First Order. We've already gone over how strong the First Order is and how even after Holdo maneuvers, their power is absolute. The Rise of Skywalker nerfs the First Order by overstating their failure at Starkiller Base to make it seem like they need Palpatine's fleet or they're in real trouble. All of which is in direct contradiction to everything shown in The Last Jedi and its opening crawl that says, "The First Order reigns." This takes Kylo several steps back as a character. He switches between a carbon copy of himself in The Force Awakens and an exposition megaphone only needed when the movie wants to show or tell you something about Rey. More on Kylo later. Palpatine's reemergence naturally draws the attention of the Resistance as well and sends Rey, Finn, and Poe on a wild goose chase that leads to Rey's origins. Because all of this is about her, Poe has no real purpose, and it reduces Finn to emotional support for Rey. Rey is unbearable in this film. The start of the movie shows her running a training course, but it's too little too late for this to excuse everything we've already seen her do. She's not going on missions with Finn and Poe because of this training, but why she even needs it is a mystery since she was already equal with Kylo before it. None of this matters anyways because the search for the Sith Wayfinder gives Rey even more unearned power that this simple training course couldn't possibly explain. Let's talk about the Force dyad. In The Last Jedi, the Force conversations between Rey and Kylo were a way for Rian Johnson to cheat and have two characters in distant locations interacting with one another. The issue isn't cheating. Force ghosts were George Lucas's way of cheating, but the difference is that one form of cheating guides the characters and the other moves the plot forward without actually developing them. The conversations were explained by Snoke saying he bridged their minds together through the Force. In The Rise of Skywalker, there is no Snoke, so the conversations are explained by a connection through the Force between Rey and Kylo that has always existed. This means that Snoke was lying for unknown reasons, and that Rey is so powerful she's half of a Force occurrence that is only seen once every few generations. The dyad is just a cheap excuse to give Rey limitless power, and have Kylo's intentions to kill Palpatine remain hidden from him. The Force conversations are no longer just conversations. They are dimensional teleportation. Force healing is basically time manipulation. Neither ability resembles the Force. In fact, Rey has more in common with Dr. Manhattan than she does with any Jedi. Force healing specifically creates a number of questions applicable to every trilogy. Why does Qui-Gon Jinn die? Obi-Wan should have just healed him using the Force. Rey does the exact same to Kylo as Maul did to Qui-Gon. Unfortunately, Obi-Wan did not run the training course and cannot heal his master. Facetiousness aside, the exploitation of the Force to fix every problem the characters have is even more reason you can't invest in any of them. The Force is, again, used as a get-out-of-jail-free card instead of a test of a character's determination and resolve. It's just a power all of these superheroes have at this point, and it's prevalent throughout the film, but the scene where Rey and Kylo use it to fight over the Sith dagger on the First Order transport exposes another critical flaw with the movie. There was something to be gained from this scene. It's the only shocking part of the movie. Yes, Rey's use of Sith lightning presents its own set of issues, but for the first time, we see her make a mistake. Even if, accidentally, she lets her powers go too far and it kills one of her friends. Except it doesn't. Chewbacca is alive in the very next scene because the Rise of Skywalker kills virtually all of its payoffs. Chewbacca's death, C-3PO's memory wipe, Kylo being stabbed, the destruction of Kijimi, etc. It's impossible to care about the movie when it constantly goes back and forth on everything. The lack of payoffs, the retcons, the Force abilities, they all say the same thing. Nothing means anything. The story the film wants to tell isn't properly set up, so it has to make its own rules as it goes along to get where it needs to be. Just look at Kylo Ren's redemption. Who is this? Star Wars has, or at least had, a very specific set of rules for how people can reappear after death. This is not a Force ghost because Han Solo was not a Jedi. So this is a hallucination and an example of how much this movie cares more about getting all of this over with than it does about being Star Wars. Kylo's redemption is not earned. He doesn't do anything that redeems him because he forgives himself through his delusions. Kylo is only redeemed because he's finished feeding Rey the information the story wants her to know, that she's the granddaughter of Emperor Palpatine. This is the height of the film's cluelessness. Rey being the granddaughter of the Emperor means nothing. We're well past the point where this could explain how powerful Rey is. It does nothing for her character because every one of these films refused to show Rey commit mistakes that could cloud her judgment and lead her to the dark side. The foreshadowing in this film in particular is more funny than it is serious, as it implies that Rey will become a shark if she falls to the dark side. It's difficult to not make light of this because of how absurd it is. The Palpatine reveal could have worked on some level, considering Rey's premise of abandoned woman looking for purpose. It could have been haunting for her to learn that the only blood relative she has is a genocidal tyrant who also killed her parents. The reason it isn't, and this doesn't work, besides the obvious ways in which this reveal makes no sense whatsoever, is because Rey's fears are contradicted through the whole movie. Rey is not alone. She is surrounded by friends she gained from being a perfect character. None of the dark side temptation is actually rooted in reality. The idea that Rey will end up all alone or on the throne is preposterous if you just look around her. Why would she fall to the dark side? What great suffering has she brought upon herself? Her only mistake is mended almost instantly. She has the power to control life and death, which is what Anakin fell to the dark side in the pursuit of. There's no reason for this character with no faults and unimaginable power to be tempted by the dark side, except for the movie wanting to have its cake and eat it too. It wants a character who can do anything while simultaneously harboring so much insecurity that they could turn at any given moment. Rey's conversation with Luke about her lineage is also devoid of any substantive perspective on this matter. This conversation could have been about people making their own choices. Anakin gave in to the dark side, yet Luke didn't. Luke wasn't defined by the actions of his father, and Rey shouldn't be by her grandfather's. But this is never mentioned. Luke just tells her that she has to face the Emperor because Jedi face their fears. Speaking of Luke, the Rise of Skywalker can't even do nostalgia pandering without breaking the rules of the universe. Admittedly, seeing Luke again and watching him raise the X-Wing out of the water put a huge smile on my face. This is the only time in 3 films we see Luke actually behave like Luke. But if Luke can grab a lightsaber and he can use the Force, is he still a ghost? This is an important question leading into the film's 3rd act. Everything comes to a head on Exegol, otherwise known as Green Screen Land. Bigger is better strikes again with the Final Order's fleet of Star Destroyers and begs the question of why the bad guys are the only people capable of building these ships. Much like Palpatine's reappearance, the Final Order and Exegol only exist out of desperation, and it's clear no thought was put into any of them. We just talked about how Rey turning to the dark side would be nonsensical, so her confrontation with the Emperor falls flat on its face. He tries turning her using the same tactic he did against Luke, an appeal to the fear of loss. But it doesn't make sense in this context.
The only family you have here is me.
The entirety of the film plays with the idea that Rey is afraid that she'll side with Palpatine because he's her only family, making her turn inevitable. But he tempts her by saying that her new family will die if she doesn't join him. So which is it? Why would she care that the Emperor is her only family if the basis of her temptation is that the family she actually cares about is in danger? If you apply the same logic to Return of the Jedi, Luke would be more concerned about ending up like Vader than the death of his friends. And that's the problem. Rey's conflict is fear about her fate. Luke's conflict was fear about the fate of others. Once Ben Solo arrives to help Rey, the superheroes do more teleportation. The Knights of Ren are a joke. They have no coherent origin story because no one could decide on one. They're destroyed like goofs, and Rey taking on the Emperor's guards is worse. They all have blasters, and none of them can land a shot on a target they're all surrounding. Once Rey and Ben stand together, Palpatine discovers the dyad between them, but there is simply no logic in Palpatine not knowing about it before this. He's been pulling the strings all along and has been in Ben's mind for years. Now, his inability to do the same with Rey is something that creates its own myriad of questions, but but you'd think he would know once she had her awakening in the Force. The most obvious explanation for him not knowing about the dyad is that it's a measure to keep the story from contradicting itself more than it already does. If Palpatine always knew they shared the dyad, it makes the previous films pointless, since he could have just had them sent to Exegol much earlier to steal their life force and remake himself. The Emperor's power once he does steal Rey and Ben's life force is once again unlimited, and yet another instance of the film not having the slightest attention to detail. Yes, this is insane, but the film could have partially explained Palpatine getting a large boost in strength by emphasizing that Exegol is the Sith homeworld. It'd have made this a bit easier to swallow and would have also explained why, despite being able to interact with the world around them, the Force ghosts of past Jedi don't show up to help Rey in physical form. It's not a stretch that their power would be suppressed on an ancient Sith planet. Unfortunately, the film chooses not to explain any of this and contradict itself, which is a shame. There's also the issue of this many Force ghosts even existing, but I think the prequels are also to blame for this. They made becoming a Force ghost a technique a Jedi had to learn, instead of something more thematically intangible. Rey hearing their voices is fantastic from a technical perspective. This scene's inclusion of prequel actors and voice actors from the animated series ties the franchise together well. You can even hear Alec Guinness's Obi-Wan in there. It doesn't mean much for the story, however. We know Rey isn't really alone, and she's already so strong with the Force that the only reason she's the underdog in this situation is because she had her own power stolen from her. Her defeating Palpatine makes him an idiot, as he kills himself with his own lightning. He learned nothing from the last time this happened to him. A death so unsatisfying is to be expected given how uninspired the film is. Rey's own death is actually just a way for the film to kill off Ben Solo. Kylo Ren was, from start to finish, a Darth Vader clone. He dies after his redemption because Anakin did first. But let's compare the level of maturity in both of these deaths. Anakin's dying wish was to see his son with his own two eyes, and not the eyes of the monster he became. This isn't a reward as much as it is an acknowledgement that Anakin was wrong. His disfigured state is a cautionary tale against making the wrong choices in life. There's none of that with Ben. First of all, he doesn't even beat the Emperor. Rey does. He then uses his superpowers to revive her and gets a big smooch for finally behaving like a decent person. What is this if it isn't a reward? How does this even make sense?
You're a monster. Murderous snake.
Anakin's death was used as the final stepping stone for Luke's development as a character, and Ben's is used so Rey has a love interest? This isn't even the last time the movie misunderstands Anakin. In the final scene of the film, Rey takes Anakin and Leia's lightsabers to Tatooine and buries them in Luke's old home. Why would Anakin want his saber buried in a place he hated? He was a slave on Tatooine. His mother was tortured and died there. Luke obviously hated it there too. Of all the planets to bury the remnants of the Skywalker family, the movie chose Tatooine because it, along with the rest of the films, always favored the familiar over what was actually logical. The sequel trilogy ends with Rey from nowhere becoming Rey Skywalker, which would have been a perfect ending if any of it was actually earned. The Star Wars sequels are terrible. They're barely a trilogy. They're tangentially related films trying to tell 3 different stories, and all of them missed the point. Star Wars is not about the Force or the power it gives the user. It's not about lightsabers or battleships. It's not about aliens and droids. Star Wars is about life. It's about coming of age. It's about trust, deception, love, fear, and everything else that we experience from the second we're born to the moment we die. The sequels thought that Star Wars was about the tools used to tell the story, and became a story about those tools, costing them their fantasy and ability to relate in the process. Something that could have been easily avoided if the people working on them understood what they were making sequels to and planned the movies out in advance. There is no magic secret to making good Star Wars films. What they need to be is clear and boils down to one question. Are they good storytellers? The answer as it pertains to the sequels is no. And instead of going down as a triumphant return, the legacy of the sequels will be failure. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd now like to give a very big thank you to everyone who became a patron during the production of this video. If you'd like to support the content, you can become a patron at patreon.com/dx, where you'll be featured in the next video's credits. A very big thank you goes out to Ariel Voss, Ann Peck, Cameron Fairs, Connor Hicks, Daniel A. Hudson, Darren Kimball, DDX, Decepticon Swag, Dude Nugget 2000, Eldex, Eternash, Ethos, Final Fash, Fourth Mathematics, Gidmodo, Jared NDN711, JCC Gamer, Johan Schaefer, John the Erudite Diaper, Kenny Nunez, Kieran Corrigan, Lolwell and Teapot, Naveed Mastani, Oxice, Psycho Render, Put Bartlett in Ranked, Rennie Pade, Stort Elliott, Triben Leonard, Vera, and Windows 07. Thank you for supporting the content, and thank you for supporting the vision.